Well, good evening to everyone who's tuning in. If this is your first time tuning in, I'm Father Charles Browning. I am the priest in charge here at St. Mary's Episcopal Church in Honolulu, and we are talking about the apocalypse, which I guess you figured out if you saw the thumbnail. If you hold on one moment, I'm going to turn off my air conditioner because it's loud to me. I don't know if it's loud to you, but it's loud to me, so give me one moment. All right, sorry about that. It's not hot in Hawaii, but it does get a little warm and under these robes. So I usually try to cool down the office a little bit more before we get started. So well, welcome to everyone tonight. We have a lot to cover because we're going to talk about some really important stuff related to the history of our religion and the Bible, and how it all speaks to this idea of apocalypse. And while I'm talking to you, I am pouring a cup of tea. So apologize if you hear that in the background. You wonder what's going on here. I promise it's tea, right? It's not a flask. Maybe that's something we could start doing since we're doing this virtually. Just make it sort of like happy hour theology. But we got a lot to cover. And so we're going to try to get right to it pretty soon here. So I invite you to open up your prayer books to page 139, if you have your prayer books with you, so that we'll say our morning or our evening prayers and our devotions and then get into it. Page 139 in the Book of Common Prayer in the early evening. Take just a quick second to center ourselves. And now let us say the opening hymn. O gracious light, pure brightness of the ever-living Father in heaven, O Jesus Christ, holy and blessed. Now as we come to the setting of the sun and our eyes behold the vesper light, we sing your praises, O God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. You are worthy at all times to be praised by happy voices, O Son of God, O Giver of life, and to be glorified through all the worlds. Our reading this evening is actually going to come from the Psalms. It will be Psalm 138. So this is one that you can actually read along if you have a prayer book with you, because the full Psalms, of course, are in here. And so we are looking at Psalm 137. Psalm 137 on page 792 in the Book of Common Prayer. Psalm 137. By the waters of Babylon we sat down and wept when we remembered you, O Zion. As for our harps, we hung them up on the trees in the midst of that land. For those who led us away captive asked us for a song, and our oppressors called for mirth. Sing for us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song upon an alien soil? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. Let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. Remember the day of Jerusalem, O Lord, because against the people of Edom, who said, down with it, even to the ground. O daughter of Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy the one who pays you back for what you have done to us. Happy shall he be who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock. Here ends the reading. This is, of course, one of the more provocative passages in the Bible, probably one of the most provocative Psalms in the Bible. Typically, it's one of those Psalms that when it does show up in the lectionary, we omit that last verse. And for good reason, because it, especially if it shows up on a Sunday, that becomes your sermon because you sort of have to address it. I'll share, without getting too much into the weeds, because this is the subject that we're going to deal with, is we're going to talk about Babylon a lot in this session this evening. And this Psalm is definitive in a lot of ways for Jewish religion in its relation to Babylon and the role Babylon played in Jewish history. But I'll share Mark Dyer of blessed memory who was a friend of mine as well as a spiritual director. I've talked about him before in various contexts, but if you don't know who he is, he was the Bishop of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, way back when, and just a beloved figure in the church. And he taught the third unit of systematic theology at Virginia Seminary when I was a student there, and just a very deeply and profoundly spiritual man. He had spent 11 years as a Benedictine monk prior to his move to the Episcopal Church, and then the priesthood in the Episcopal Church and the episcopate. And one night when I spent a summer, it was a really blessed summer. I got to live with him and Amy in their house on campus, and while I was doing my hospital chaplaincy work. And I remember one night sitting around the table, we were talking, and the subject of the Psalms and the way we like omit verses and stuff from the Psalms came up, and Psalm 137 came up in the conversation. And Mark was from Boston, and so he had a bit of a Boston accent. And I remember him saying, people don't want to say that verse at the end of Psalm 137. It's just stupid. It's stupid to ignore that verse. I said he's stupid. Is the sort of way he said it. His argument was that he said it's the most emotionally honest. It's probably the most emotionally honest passage of scripture in the entire Bible, because that's how the people of Israel felt at that time. Everything they had been stolen from them. They had been carted off. Jerusalem had been destroyed. They've been carted off, and they've been forced into a foreign land. And then on top of that, here you've got people expecting them to perform in the midst of that oppressive place. And so, and the Babylonians did horrible things to the Jews, and the Assyrians before them also did horrible things. And so this is the feeling that they had. It doesn't justify it. And this was the thing that Mark said. He said, just because it's in there doesn't mean it justifies it. Doesn't mean this is what we should be doing, and we shouldn't enact those kinds of violence. But he says it's good for us to see that kind of emotion, that kind of, that sort of raw pain and anger there, even as we can condemn it from a theological, Christological standpoint. It's important for us to see it, because a lot of times in the church, we're not emotionally vulnerable. We're not emotionally honest. We become polite, and we keep that stuff sort of sequestered over here, and we sort of have these ideas that we're not allowed to have outbursts, right? But the Psalms show that you can have, this Psalm shows that you can have that kind of level of rage, and it's not necessarily holy rage, and it's not necessarily, again, like endorsed. It's just there. And it's important for us to look at it and to explore it and to meditate on that, even as we are, appalled by it, and rightfully should be appalled by it. That's kind of the point of it. There's a lot of appalling things in the Bible, and just because they're in there, again, doesn't mean that they're being endorsed. It's just they're there, and they're part of it. And so we have to be aware of it and meditate on it and hold it in tension with all that's revealed, and in a way, the horribleness of that passage preaches in the sense that, we say it's horrible because Jesus has revealed the nature of that kind of horrible mentality and mindset, if that makes any sense. But the main reason that I had us reflect on this passage is because of that opening line, by the waters of Babylon we wept. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but the Jews were exiled in two waves from Jerusalem, and they were settled in an area near the Kabar River, which we know from history, where a bunch of Babylonian Near Eastern immigrants were sort of forced to be. And so it was this packed immigrant city on the banks of this big river. And so this is basically the feeling, the moment, capturing that feeling of we're finally in our new home, and how can we be happy about this, right? How can we find any joy here? How can we sing the Lord's songs in a foreign land? And that sentiment, that mentality is actually central, because as we'll see, a good chunk of our Old Testament was written in this time period, and our theological ideas were developed in this time period. And it speaks to this whole concept of apocalypse that we're discussing, that comes from this particular time period, which becomes very central. And so that gives us some insight into the spirit and the mindset of the people behind our scriptures and the tradition as we've received it. That they are a people in trauma, and they are a people who are, just destroyed. They're a destroyed, broken people, trying to figure out where things went wrong and how God can fix it. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So with that, let's take a moment of silence as we offer our own prayers and thanksgivings to God. And in the spirit of the reading, I ask us to keep in our prayers those children who have been neglected, those children who are abused and harmed, those innocent people who are victims of someone else's rage and retribution. And especially remember all those children who have been put in the camps and cages in the southern border, who've been separated from their families. And let us pray the prayer that our Lord Jesus taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Lord Jesus, stay with us, for evening is at hand and the day is past. Be our companion in the way. Kindle our hearts and awaken hope that we may know you as you are revealed in Scripture and the breaking of bread. Grant this for the sake of your love. Amen. All right. So now we're going to get into it. I'm going to let you know that I have lots of pages of notes, but I want to share with you for the past couple of days where I have been, and it's these books right here. You've got right here 2 volumes from Robert Alter's translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, the collection of the prophets and the collection of the writings. So I've been looking at his notes and translations on the book of Ezekiel and the book of Daniel. And then we have the Orthodox Study Bible, we have the Jewish Study Bible, and then we have the Jewish annotated New Testament, which will end up being more important for us next week. But I want you to know I do my homework, okay? Which is funny just as a personal note, because I never did homework in high school. I was not a very good student. But now I've come to realize that my whole life is doing homework. So you learn to do it. I had to tell my kids that when they don't want to do their homework. It's like, well, just think about it. You could end up being like me, where your job is homework. All right, so I'm going to try to be brief with the history here, because we gotta talk about this crucial time period. So the time before, during, and immediately after the Babylonian exile gives us the Judaism that we Christians tend to know, as well as pretty much the Old Testament as we know it. I don't know about you, but there's this sense that I grew up with this belief that things are a little bit more linear, that as like the Exodus and different things are happening, there was somebody sort of taking notes along the way and writing this stuff out. But the reality of it is that a lot of this stuff existed as folk stories or oral traditions handed down. The Bible refers to the annals of the kings. And so there were places where various things were written down in other documents and books recording elements and moments of history, right? We know that the Torah existed in some written form for much of Jewish history. And so we had these, so there's a combination of writings, but there's also legends, and there's, and stories and other things that were told that were commonly held by the people throughout much of their history. But it doesn't really get put into book form as we understand it until starting around this time, in the decades leading up to the Babylonian exile, and then especially during the Babylonian exile, and then even a little bit after. So here's what happens, right? I'm going to give broad strokes history, okay? So we know that the Israelites are the Hebrews are liberated from Egypt in captivity, their time in captivity. They establish themselves in a land that they believe is promised to them through an ancestor named Abraham. They fight hard to sort of capture and take ownership of this land against a whole range of peoples that were living in the area. In addition to that, they deal with threats from much feared sea people that we call the Philistines. And they go through a period of time where they are a loose confederation of 12 tribes, kind of trying to hold themselves together as a common people. Eventually, they decide that they want to be a kingdom like other kingdoms, that they have a better chance of providing a united front against any would-be aggressors as a kingdom. So a man by the name of Saul is called up to be king, and he helps foster a kingdom. But of course, he falls out of grace and is removed after a whole range of things happening. But another young man by the name of David comes to power, and David is sort of like the great king, and he ushers in the golden age of this kingdom of Jews. And he brings international renown. His son Solomon then carries it to a level of wealth and international prestige that they could only dream and imagine. But the problem is that Solomon sort of overworks the people, and he overspends a little bit. And so after he dies, his son decides that he wants to one-up his dad and take it to the next level. So he pushes the people, and that leads to a ton of resentment, even some pushback, until ultimately, like 10 tribes decide they want nothing to do with this kingdom and they want to start their own. And so they establish a kingdom in the north, centered around the capital city of Samaria, and they call it the Northern Kingdom of Israel, or just Israel, the Kingdom of Israel. The Southern Kingdom, which has 2 tribes, remains as the Kingdom of Judah. So they go through this long period of time where they have these 2 kings, and they have good relationships, they have bad relationships, but all the kings of both kingdoms sort of, waffle. They end up falling in with idol worshipers and making bad deals with other kingdoms. Eventually, the Assyrian Empire develops in the Middle East, and it moves through and winds up taking the Northern Kingdom, somewhat as the result of the Southern Kingdom, Judah, sort of throwing them under the bus as a way to protect themselves from the encroaching Assyrian Empire. So it's somewhat around this time, after the fall of the Northern Kingdom. There's a bunch of obscure kings, and then one day this king dies, and he leaves his heirs, this 8-year-old boy by the name of Josiah. And so Josiah becomes king at 8 years of age. He grows up, advisors give him, some help, whatever. But by the time he's sort of seen as old enough to be his own person, his own king, he's looking around and he sees that the kingdom is faltering. There's threats on the horizon for everyone. And on top of that, the kingdom's running out of money, and it's just not doing well. So he sends one of his advisors to the temple. Now, the temple at this point is in disrepair. It's just covered in cobwebs. Very few people are using it. It's only the oldest people in the country that are still practicing their Judaism. Most people are worshiping the gods of the other nations around them. Just to kind of put it in a local context, it's probably a little bit like how after I can't remember the queen's name here in Hawaii, but the queen who abolished, it was Kamehameha, the first wife, who abolished, led to abolish the Kapu system. You hear these stories that after that happened, and then after the missionary era, right? You've got, stories of, someone's got an uncle who has, an altar in his backyard and continues to offer, services and stuff to Kane and Pele and things like that, right? It's largely abolished, but you've still got these pockets of people who hold on to the old ways. That's kind of what's happening in Israel at this time. You've got these people who see Judaism as the old ways, and they're keeping it going. In the midst of all this other stuff, this foreign religion that's taken over the area. And so what happens is Josiah then sends one of his advisors into this temple and says, hey, see if you can find anything of value in there. Maybe we can sell some stuff and make some money for the kingdom. And so he goes, and while this advisor is in there, he finds this scroll and he blows the dust off of it. And he starts reading it, and he's shocked to find out that it details this Jewish history and details that people had made a covenant with God, that God rescued them from Egypt, and that, as long as they keep good with God, their kingdom will be established forever. And so this guy brings it to Josiah. Josiah reads it. he puts on mourning cloth and like throws himself like, covers himself in ashes and just mourns. And he's basically lamenting like, oh my gosh, this is what's happened. This is where everything went wrong. And so Josiah begins this great program of religious renewal and religious reform. He gets scribes and others to bring out all the books of the law and all the kinds of things that are in the temple, renovate them, rebuild the temple, help give instruction, and we start seeing evidence that the Torah gets revisited and gets some commentary and some other things happening in there. For instance, if you read, say, Leviticus 18, and the only reason I'm using Leviticus 18 is because of my background in doing studies of the church and reconciliation with same sexuality. I know that passage because it's one of the go-to, homophobic passages. But Leviticus 18 has all this stuff about sexual sins, and it says, don't do them. But it doesn't offer any punishment. But if you go over to Leviticus 21, I think it is, you get a repetition of this list, but it has now punishments of what's supposed to happen. So scholars seem to think that at this point in time, Josiah's reforms are looking to shore up things that are happening. So you have the original writing of the law, but then you have these additions that are put to it that give a little bit more detail. It's almost like it's saying well, here's what we think it's really trying to say. Or here's what we really need to be doing. The point of it, of course, is all part of this program of getting Israelites to see hey, look, you've abandoned your culture. You've forgotten who you are. You've allowed all this foreign influence to come in. That's what's watered us down. That's what's led us in obscurity and why we're sort of always at risk of being overtaken by other people. We need to be our own people, right? And so in some ways, it's almost like the Meiji Restoration in Japan where there's this thing of Matthew Perry has shown up. The modern world is coming. We can either get colonized or we can sort of define ourselves as our own people and try to, face it, head on. And so this is what Josiah begins. And it seems very successful and popular. Then Josiah dies. And his son decides that he doesn't want any part of that anymore. And he wants to go back to worshiping the gods and doing all this kind of stuff of all these other foreign gods and whatnot. He likes it. In fact, he seems to enjoy spending a lot of time in Egypt. Which the Bible's doesn't give much information on, but you kind of get the impression that maybe he treats trips to Egypt the way some politicians treat, trips to say Vegas or whatever. And while they're in Egypt, he gets kidnapped because the Pharaoh says, well, look, hey, the Assyrian Empire is out there, but Babylonians are now becoming a threat. As an aside, who are the Babylonians? Well, the Babylonians were part of the Assyrian Empire because the Assyrian Empire was a confederation of city-states. But Babylonia, one of the city-states, decided that, hey, we can run things better. And so it started its own program of sort of trying to take over the Assyrian Empire. So the Assyrians had developed a partnership with Egypt to try to prevent a united front. The Assyrians recognized that Judah was a very strategic kingdom because right there on the border of their, they've taken the northern kingdom, so they want Judah. So they kidnap the king of Judah. They establish a vassal king in his place, and then the Assyrians wind up getting taken over by the Babylonians. And so this client king, this vassal king, says, well, I see the writing on the wall, so I'm going to make a treaty with Nebuchadnezzar, who's the king of Babylon. I'm going to say, hey, look, we can come up with this agreement where, you don't take us over, and we'll kind of serve you, but there's no violence or bloodshed. Nebuchadnezzar's like, cool, that works, whatever. After a few years, though, the king is like, you know what? I don't really like the idea of being under this guy's authority. So I think we should lead an insurrection and try to chase them off a little bit. It is not successful. And Nebuchadnezzar then decides to punish the king of Judah by raiding the city of Jerusalem and then carting off all the aristocrats, all the priests, all the advisors, anybody with any kind of education or wealth. He takes all of them and brings them into the Babylonian territories, leaves only the poorest of the poor. And then he grabs one of Josiah's nephews and sticks him as king and basically is forcing him to be king over, just a broken kingdom. On top of that, the temple is looted of all of its goods. So this guy who's now in place decides, well, I don't like this either. So he tries to lead a secondary rebellion. Nebuchadnezzar moves in and at this point takes everybody into Babylon, destroys Jerusalem, destroys the temple, and just leaves the whole area completely decimated. And, no stone is left on top of each other. The ground, it's just place is destroyed. And everybody's taken into Babylon. At this point, the great lament happens. Well, among the people who were taken in that first exile, the priests, the wealthy, the advisors, the educated, all that. Among those are two figures, Ezekiel and Daniel. as well as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who I can't remember. They get Babylonian names if you read the story. But they're all part of this group of people that are taken into Babylon. And they're established in the Kebar River. And around this time, Ezekiel starts to have his visions. So what happens? So we need to start talking about one thing before we move on, and that is prophecy. Okay, what do we mean by prophecy? Because that's a very misunderstood concept in Christianity. You have some people who think that prophecy is only about knowing and telling the future, but that is only a small part of prophecy, and that is specifically known as an oracle. Prophecy is a broader concept that really deals with speaking truth to power. As I have defined it here, prophecy is a broad term that involves the discerning and distilling of spiritual truths behind events. So we have oracles that are about the future, and then we have apocalypses, which are also they're about the future, but it's highly poetic language, and it's about the more distant and, sort of dark future, the vague future that we don't know much about. Whereas oracles are more about the near future, and they are more akin to the fact that that prophets are people who sort of are able to read, they're able to read the signs, right? They can sort of figure out what's happening and where things are going. As an aside, Barbara Rossing, who wrote this book about the rapture called The Rapture Exposed that I talked about last week and that my friend Nick helpfully gave me the author's name, she talks about prophecy in a really interesting way, and it's particularly around with apocalypse as well, by using Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol. So it's appropriate for this season. Because the character of Jacob Marley in that is an apocalyptic figure, right? He shows up as a ghost and he's bound in chains. With the chains, he's dragging all these symbols of his past life around, and he's there to tell Scrooge, unless you amend your ways, the same thing's going to happen to you. And so he's offering this oracle, this vision of the future, and it's this highly poetic, experience. And so ultimately, Scrooge, is faced with the eschatology, the end of his own existence, and so he amends his ways or whatever. So it's a kind of that gives us a little bit of apocalyptic language and what the goal of apocalypse, as well as oracles, are, which is to say, hey, here's where things are going. Here's where I see things are going. This is where I feel God is telling me where things are going, and unless we change, here's what's going to happen. But apocalypse takes it to this next level, which uses the Greek word eschaton, which is the end, right? And we talked about the end last week, not necessarily being the terminus of the world, but like sort of the goal of where it's going. And so apocalypse is about that. And, we talked about that last week, and we'll get into it a little bit more. But Ezekiel is an interesting book because Ezekiel is primarily a prophet. And primarily a prophet of the current time. He is actually spending most of his time addressing the Jews in exile and basically saying, here's where we all went wrong. And unless we change our ways, it's, if we change our ways, God will return us, to our homeland. If we don't amend our ways, then we're going to continue having these problems. But Ezekiel has some apocalyptic moments in his book. In the prophecy associated with him. So Ezekiel's a high priest. He was he is a priest of the temple. He's not a high priest, but he's a priest of the temple. He was taken in that first exile. And while in the Kebar River region, he starts having these visions that basically show, hey, here's where everything went wrong. But these visions also allow him to see the heavenly realms. And he gives much more vivid detail than other prophets who give us such insight, similar to things like Isaiah and Jeremiah, who, of course, is also active at this time. But Ezekiel gives us stuff that we'll start seeing later in other apocalyptic books. We get the throne room of God, where we get these four beasts, or we get these beasts. There's four, but we get these heavenly beasts, and we have this figure of like amber in the midst of fire. So we had this stuff that we classically associate with like the book of Revelation starting to show up in his writing. So what Ezekiel is primarily concerned with is he is, of course, the inheritor of Josiah's religious reforms. And so he is very much concerned with faithfulness. Overwhelmingly, the book of Ezekiel is basically looking at Israel as an unfaithful person. And he repeatedly uses the imagery of prostitution and adultery. Some scholars would argue that Ezekiel is fairly misogynistic in his writing, and it might be true. You can look into this stuff on your own. Some of the most shocking language in the Bible comes from Ezekiel 23 in particular, which is, you can look it up on your own time. It is not for children. Just as an aside, my friend Nick, if he's watching, he may remember when we worked at the bookstore at Virginia Seminary, we once spent a slow afternoon going through every single English translation of the Bible on our shelves, looking for the best translation of Ezekiel 23, the winner of which was the Inclusive Bible, which is touted as the first egalitarian translation. But again, this is very offensive, vulgar, shocking language that he uses to talk about Israel as an unfaithful spouse, as an unfaithful woman, because that was the ancient world liked to characterize cities in feminine language. But it's ultimately a part of this theme of faithfulness, of fidelity to God and God alone, rather than giving yourself over to other nations and what they're represented by their gods and things like that. And so Ezekiel, that's Ezekiel's primary thing in his writings against Israel. But we see that, so idolatry is the catalyst for calamity for him. And so he's starting to show what's going on behind the scenes, that this is more than just, he would say it's more than bad politics. It's a long running problem, spiritual and moral problem for God's people in the southern kingdom of Judah that comes back on them. And so he gives us these visions. The important ones that, for purposes of apocalyptic discussion, are the things like the throne room and the heavenly beasts. So the beasts are very weird. This is in Ezekiel chapter 1, where you start meeting these things. He's right out the gate with the weirdness. He talks about these beasts that have 4 faces. They're covered in wings. The faces face different directions. When the angels, or when these beasts, which are angelic beings, as we would interpret them now, the way they move is that they never turn. They just move in a straight line. And he mentions that they are accompanied with wheels within wheels that never turn, which some intrepid UFO types love to think that this is a reference to UFOs and aliens, that Ezekiel was visited by aliens and he interpreted them as angelic beings because he didn't know any better, which that's a fun interpretation. But this, if we read Ezekiel chapter 1 or the first 4 chapters of Ezekiel, it's super weird, and we're going to feel bewildered by it. But the thing is that we're looking at close to 3,000 years, give or take, removal from Ezekiel's time. Probably more like 2,500 years removal from Ezekiel's time, and we have to realize that he comes from a very different world and a very different place. Now, if I open a story and I tell you that, I was sitting by the ocean and I suddenly had this vision and this light shot out of the sky and my eyes were open and I saw a figure that looked like a man dressed in white with a white beard, and light glowed from him. And there were figures that looked like humans, but they had bird-like wings and halos around their heads moving all around this figure. You'd be like, oh yeah, you have a vision of heaven. You're seeing God and the angels. Well, that's because in our culture, that's how we understand. We've been conditioned through Renaissance art and other things to see heaven in very particular ways. We think of heaven as, a white guy with a white beard among clouds with maybe some golden, gate work or whatever behind him. And then he's surrounded by these little fat cherub, angel beings with wings that have little, halos over top of their heads, and they play harps, right? This is I could go on if you want me to sometime to go through the whole tradition of how we got from, 4-faced composite beasts covered in wings and eyes to, little chubby babies with wings. But it's a development that has happened over the centuries to where now that's what we associate heaven with. But in Ezekiel's day, when people thought of the heavenly realms and the realms of the gods, this is what they thought of. They imagined a place where these composite beasts dwelt. And artistic representations of them are everywhere in the ancient Mesopotamian world, or any culture rooted in the Mesopotamian world. Because again, we have to remember, Ancient Judaism, there's a pretty straight line from like the Sumerian religion, which is the first civilization that we really know about, the Sumerian culture and religion, all the way to the Jewish people. All these ancient Semitic peoples have common iconography, religious practices and images and other things that they're drawing on from one another. So we see these statues. And in fact, the temple in Jerusalem had them. If you look in the book of, it's either Exodus or Leviticus, where they describe the design of the temple. Or sorry, it's in 2 Samuel, where you see the design of the temple. It mentions that there are carvings of beasts and winged beasts and lions and other things inside the temple. And on top of that, the Ark of the Covenant is described in Exodus as having, these winged creatures on the top of it facing one another, which, as an aside, I've always wondered how that fit with the commandments that says you should make no graven images of four-footed beasts or anything like that. But they've had it in the temple. That one's kind of baffled me. Maybe that's one of Josiah's notations. But anyway, so this is just the common way that people thought of the supernatural and heavenly realms. And so, somebody in Ezekiel's day might have read this and thought, oh, okay, well, he had a vision of heaven, right? We see it as this other world crazy. We think maybe he's on drugs or something. But it was common language and metaphors for the people of his time. That stuff is important. God's throne room and how it's depicted is important. We'll see it picked up a little. We'll see elements of it picked up in Daniel. We'll definitely see elements of it picked up even further in the book of Revelation when we get to the New Testament. But he sort of offers this prototype idea of apocalyptic literature, because Ezekiel's not a true apocalypse. It's got elements that are picked up by apocalyptic writers. Daniel will be our first true apocalypse. We'll get to him in a moment, but that's something I want to hold on to. I also want to mention that Ezekiel is bold in his prophecies, because what he's describing is he describes as seeing the glory of the Lord. Now, glory is this word that I can't remember the Hebrew word, but it's the English translation of this word that refers to basically the parts of God that we're allowed to see. So famously in the book of Exodus, Moses is not allowed to see God's glory. He's told that if he sees God's glory, he would die on the spot. And so the only thing Moses is ever permitted to see is he sees God's hand covering his eyes, and he sees God's back as he walks away. So Ezekiel makes a bold claim that he's afforded something that even Moses, who's like the great hero of Judaism, wasn't even allowed to see. So that's a shocking thing from Ezekiel. But we have this. So we have in the early chapters this picture of God's heavenly throne room. We also get this element in the early chapters where Ezekiel is commanded to eat a scroll. He consumes the scroll, and he says it was sweet as honey in his mouth. But it's a symbolic way of saying that his job is to go and proclaim God's judgment. And it's kind of interesting. He says it was sweet in his mouth. So it's kind of very telling that he almost enjoys his prophecy. He enjoys telling people how wrong they are. But that eating of the scroll will be revisited also in the book of Revelation. It's the only reason I bring it up. So I'll talk more about that next week when we get to Revelation, but it's in Revelation chapter 8. And so overall, Ezekiel is a provocative prophet speaking to the spiritual state of people in exile and offering both a diagnosis of their predicament as well as a remedy, which is the theme of faithfulness reasserted during Josiah's reign. So we can see, okay, what begun with Josiah is picked up during the Babylonian exile and reasserted. And Jews, of course, are trying to figure out their identity and their culture in a foreign land. And so they build on this reformed religion that was given to them by Josiah and start amending it in a way that allows them to live among this foreign and idolatrous people. And so they begin to sort of carve out this identity over and against them, as well as learning to incorporate elements of that, which we'll see with Daniel. But I do want to say we do get some interesting new developments that come from Ezekiel. Ezekiel 37 is probably the most famous passage in all of Ezekiel, and that is the Valley of Dry Bones. So dem bones, dem bones. He's speaking of a resurrection of the dead. Now, this is something that was fairly novel and innovative within Jewish thinking. Prior to this time, Jews did not largely hold to the idea that people would come back from the dead. They believed that people sort of lived on after death. They lived in in Sheol, the grave. But the idea that we would come back from death is something that really doesn't get a whole lot of currency in Jewish thinking until at least the Greek era, when Hellenization impacts Judaism. This is one of the reasons why when you read the New Testament, in the Gospels, you have this moment where Jesus is having this argument with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the writer of the Gospel says that the Pharisees believe in the resurrection, but the Sadducees do not. It's a new enough idea within Judaism that you have these kinds of debates. The Sadducees, which represent the temple priesthood, are old school, and they see the Pharisees as buying into some innovative new theology and new ideas. Even though it was a couple hundred years old by this point, it's still considered innovative by their standards. But the Valley of Dry Bones gives us this idea. Not only is it a poetic depiction of how Israel is going to be restored, even from the point of death, but it opens up this space, this intellectual space for the idea that death can be undone, which will be a big thing for the future. But we also get in Ezekiel, starting in chapter 38, we read of Gog of Magog, or Gog of Magog. If you're in any way familiar with apocalyptic stuff, you may have heard these names, and that it sometimes uses like a type of the Antichrist and different things like that. So the thing about Gog and Magog, which is interesting, and this is probably the most apocalyptic thing in Ezekiel's writings, is that as far as we know, Gog of Magog does not correspond to any known ruler or kingdom. Magog is mentioned early on in the Bible, and he's one of the offspring of Japheth, Noah's kids. Magog is to the north, and Assyria had been, I believe, to the north, but there is this belief that, aggression and conquering can come from the north, come from the sea, and it can come from the north. Those are the traditional places where Israel saw their threats. What it seems is that what Ezekiel is trying to do with the figure of Gog of Magog is basically he's acknowledging that once Israel returns to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is restored and the temple is restored, that there will be another threat. And that he doesn't know what that threat's going to be, but he envisions that there will be more. And so Gog of Magog becomes the archetype of whatever that threat is going to be. And what he ultimately says is even that threat will also be defeated by God. And so Ezekiel ultimately offers this hope of the future that, yes, there will always be threats. Yes, there will always be someone out to get God's people. But in the end, God will defeat them, whoever they may be. And so there's this sort of mythological figure there that he brings up. I wanted to note as well something I found very interesting in my studies of the book of Ezekiel, just as an aside. Ezekiel chapter 43, verses 5 through 6. We get this great moment where Ezekiel says, "A wind picked me up and brought me to the inner courtyard of the temple, and there the Lord's glory filled the temple. A man was standing next to me, but the voice that I heard came from inside the temple." What I love about this is we've got a wind, we've got the Lord, which is Adonai or Hashem, the sacred name of God. And it says his glory filled the temple, but a man was standing next to me, but the voice that I heard came from inside the temple. So we have a Trinitarian illusion in the book of Ezekiel, which I think is very cool. So, the idea that all, the three persons of the Trinity are present would not have been, of course, been recognized by his audience of the time, but as Christians, this stuff is unavoidable for us. And so that's one thing we can see in there. Just thought that was kind of cool. But this brings us to Daniel. Now, Daniel is a weird book because the book of Daniel is written in two languages and is likely not written by the same person. It's possibly up to three authors in the book of Daniel. Chapters 1 through 6 of the book of Daniel is like a biography of Daniel. And then it's written in the language of Aramaic. Whereas 7 through the rest of the chapter is in Hebrew, but a Hebrew that, according to Robert Alter, in whose big books I've got back here, he says that it looks like somebody who is probably a native Aramaic speaker trying to write in Hebrew in order to make his writing come off as something of an earlier development. Now, so this of course raises an interesting thing that we have to deal with in terms of addressing issues with the Bible, and that is the possibility that the people who claim to have written it didn't. And some people, this is a crisis of faith kind of thing for them. The deal is that in the ancient world, they did not see people writing in the name of other people as a problem. It was not seen as dishonest because it would have, to them, it would have been seen as, I'm writing in the spirit of who this person is. Therefore, these words I write might as well be theirs. It's a very foreign concept to us, but that's how some people in the ancient world were. It was not considered dishonest or wrong. So Daniel seems to be this folk hero of Judaism that arises during the Babylonian exile. In fact, Ezekiel mentions him in chapter 14, verse 20. I think I got that right. He says that he mentions the faithfulness of Noah, Job, and Daniel. Which is interesting people because these are three people that are listed of being super faithful. So Daniel, as best we can tell from reading the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel, is this folk hero. So he was this, a young man who was taken during the exile, and he is cast in very similar role to Joseph in that he's an interpreter of dreams, and as a result of that is elevated to high status within a foreign kingdom. So he's a lot like Joseph. He's great as you can imagine the kind of folk hero that he represents for the Jewish people in exile, because here he's prospered, and he's also prospered because of his faithfulness. If you read the book of Daniel and the first 6 chapters of Daniel, that's this whole story is that he refuses to bow down. He refuses to back down. Same thing with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And even though threats on their life are made, they survive. God carries them through. And as a result, they are elevated to higher and higher positions of government as a result of their faithfulness to God. So you can imagine, right, that with the prophetic work that's happening and this push to say, look, idolatry is how we got ourselves into this situation. Avoiding idolatry is how we're going to get ourselves out of this situation. So here's Daniel. Be like Daniel, who may very well have been a historical person, but he takes on this folk hero characteristic. And that becomes even more apparent when you read through the Apocrypha, through books like Susanna and Bella and the Dragon and the Prayer of Azariah and the Song of the Three Young Men, which is a hymn attributed to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego while they're in the fiery furnace. Susanna is a great example because Susanna is a novella and it's a mystery novel. And it involves Daniel being able to determine, who's lying in a court thing. It's a very fun book of the Apocrypha to read. But again, it shows that Daniel is taking on this folk hero status. So that's the first half of the book, and that's the part that's written in Aramaic. The part that's written in Hebrew are these apocalyptic visions ascribed to Daniel. But pretty much the unanimous consensus of scholars is that these were actually written during the time of the Greeks, when the Greeks were in control of Israel. So let me bring you up to speed in terms of history. So the Babylonian Empire is taken over by the Medo-Persians, and the Medo-Persians decide that, hey, you know what, Israel, you guys can go back home. Go. And then here's some money to help you rebuild your temple and rebuild your walls. And so figures like Ezra and Nehemiah are big responsible in making this all happen. And so Israel is restored for a period of time. And then Alexander the Great conquers the known world. And then Alexander the Great, on his deathbed, is like, I'm not just giving this to anybody. He breaks his kingdom up among his 4 generals, and now they've got to fight with one another. And so they fight with one another. And then eventually, the Seleucids, I think, are the ones who wind up sort of becoming the leaders there. And out of this comes a guy by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes IV, or Antiochus IV Epiphanes, or however you want to pronounce his name. And he is arrogant, and he is cruel, and he does not like the Jews. And so one of the things that Antiochus does when he arrives, let me just mention before I get to that, this is coinciding with this wave of influence from the Greeks called Hellenization, where Greek learning is implemented, Greek philosophy becomes a part of life. In Israel, if you read through the book of First Maccabees, you'll find in the first chapters that Jews are really wanting to become like cosmopolitan Greeks. They are obscuring their circumcisions. They're doing all kinds of things to try to make themselves look non-Jewish. Antiochus arrives and he's like, okay, we're going to fully Hellenize you. And so he goes into the temple, desecrates the temple by sacrificing a pig on the high altar. And then he builds an altar to Zeus over top of the high altar in the Holy of Holies. So he completely desecrates the temple. This is a horrible thing. And the Jewish people, of course, are irate. Eventually, a guy by the name of Judas Maccabee will rise up and lead a revolt against him. And that whole thing is captured in the story of Hanukkah, which, of course, is also remembered at this time of year. And that's all about the repurification of the temple. So Antiochus and his desecration and all this horrible stuff that's happening and all of this sort of self-loathing and denial of cultural uniqueness, all this stuff that kind of was happening in the lead up to the Babylonian exile is now happening during this Greek era. And so here comes somebody who's like, all right, I'm going to write in the voice of this person who was this faithful folk hero of the Jews during the Babylonian exile. And I'm going to set it during the Babylonian exile as a reminder to people of where we're coming from and what has happened, what we have to avoid going forward. From a literary standpoint, this is fairly similar, I think, to like the recent Wonder Woman movie, which was set during World War I. That setting means something, right? It's not arbitrary. It's not just because they want to do cool costume work, right? The whole idea of setting the first Wonder Woman movie during World War I was to show that man's world had failed, that Western males had been given control of the world, and they wound up killing one another in massive amounts, right? And that led to this whole that was the beginning moment of just sort of endless war going throughout, now almost, like a full century of just sort of, war leading to war, leading to war, leading to the war. And so that's a commentary, right? Setting Wonder Woman as a comment in that time period is a commentary that, hey, maybe men have screwed up and we should let someone else have a chance. So that's kind of the thing, right? Like so the prophecies of Daniel are sort of a period piece. And so they're set during the time of Babylon, but they're intended to look to the future, but they're actually talking about the Greek period. And they're specifically talking about Antiochus. So with Daniel, once you get into the apocalypse here, he's our first true apocalypse. And so once you get to chapter 7, it opens with 4 beasts rising from the sea. And these are symbolic of foreign powers. It represents the 4 kingdoms, right? It represents the Babylonians, and it represents the Medo-Persians, and it represents the Greeks and all of that. So it's telling this story of what has happened to Israel. The last beast that shows up is mentioned as a leopard with 4 heads. Those 4 heads are symbolic of the 4 kingdoms that the 4 generals. So that was left by Alexander upon his death. And it mentions that it has horns. And out of those horns is a little horn. It has 10 horns. I think it was like the 10 rulers or whatever during that time period. And then one shows up, a little horn, and it spouts blasphemies, and it's arrogant, and it's just hateful and just boisterous and full of itself and violent and all of that. Well, that's meant to represent Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And this is an important thing because this figure, this symbolic language and the symbolic figure, the little horn, is Daniel's way of introducing something that we would call the anti-Messiah. Maybe we call it the Antichrist, but that's a kind of a loaded concept. The anti-Messiah. It is the opposite of this anointed figure that prophets had started to talk about, beginning with Isaiah. And we'll talk about this in a moment because I want to save it for the end. So Daniel introduces also this idea of a figure that rises up who is just equally as hateful toward God as one who would be anointed, for God's purposes. And so Antiochus Epiphanes fits the bill, and that's how he's describing him. He's describing him as just this arrogant person who is completely against everything that God wants. This idea, of course, is great because though it's tied to a historic figure, it's written in such a way that it's sort of like the Gog of Magog thing that Ezekiel talked about, where even though it's about a particular person, it becomes archetypal, and so it can be applied to other figures. We'll see in the book of Revelation how this figure, this anti-Messiah, is used to talk about, who we think is like Nero, but it's also been used by people throughout history to look at various other historical figures, and it allows us to have an archetype of what an anti-Messiah looks like. So again, right, he's described as opposed to God and God's people. The anti-Messiah is self-aggrandizing. He's dishonest. He's arrogant. He's vengeful, unafraid to desecrate a holy space, and completely self-interested. Does it sound like anyone we know through history? Right? We can probably start going through our history books and pointing out names and pointing out figures. I don't want to say names because I don't. I mean, you know why? But this, again, it's an archetype. It's a figure that is meant to transcend history and gives us as faithful people someone to look at and say, oh, okay, so we got to watch out for this guy. We got to watch out for this person. Let's not align ourselves with this person, because throughout history, faithful people have been sort of bamboozled and duped by these kinds of people. And so if we know how to look for them and how to identify them, we can avoid the problems and the repetitions that have led to the problems that have repeated themselves throughout history, the history of God's people. One of the other things that Daniel introduces to us are named angelic beings. So we get your Gabriel and we get Raphael. Or no, we don't get Raphael. That he shows up in the Apocrypha. It's Michael and Gabriel who are named in Michael and Gabriel are the two angels that show up in Daniel. This is an interesting concept because, as we've seen, the angelic beings, we have beasts. We have, Isaiah talks about the cherubim, who are the cherubim, who are, covered in eyes, covered in wings, very terrifying looking figures. They're far from the angels that we think of from popular art. But Michael and Gabriel, on the other hand, are depicted as being like men. They're being like, but they're an interesting figure because they seem to originate from Babylon, in the sense that, so within Babylonian world, city-states and groups of people, they believed that they had a sort of heavenly analog or a divine analog for them. So like each city-state in Babylon had, like the Babylonia had a person that was like a divine sort of representation, embodiment of them collectively in a personified form. And that figure was seen as an intermediary between some supreme God, is also seen as a defender. So it makes sense that Jews living in Babylon would be like, well, we need one of those, right? Like that's just the worldview that we're living with. And so we got to let people know that we've got one of those. And so we get Michael, who becomes the defender of Israel, but he's also sort of a representative figure of Israel. But we also get Gabriel. Gabriel also plays a somewhat defender role, but more commonly throughout the scriptures is depicted as a messenger, as the one who carries messages from God to anointed figures. And so again, this is the idea of Michael and Gabriel developing during this time and showing up in the apocalyptic literature, I think, is such a fascinating thing, because it shows the influence of the Babylonian world on Jews, but in a way that's like, we're going to borrow this idea, but we're also going to apply it in a way that makes sense for us as Jews, rather than like, we might want to say it's almost syncretistic, but that doesn't seem right. It's just a very interesting way of showing Judaism's adaptability and nimble qualities. In some ways, just as an aside, it shows, Judaism is very good about this because they adapt. You can think of during the Middle Ages, right? The church is in power. Jewish communities exist all throughout Europe. And so the church, has parish churches and they have priests, they have clergy. Well, Judaism didn't really have that. Their clergy were in the temple and they're all destroyed. And so they sort of work within that framework, and they sort of conceive of the synagogue as like their version of a church, and they conceive of their rabbis as clergy, and that's how some changes begin to develop. And yes, Stacey, just like early Christians borrowing Platonic philosophy, right, which is also the carryover from the Hellenism that makes its way into Judaism as well. It's not all bad. Philo of Alexandria is a very important figure who is a Jewish thinker who borrows a lot of Greek ideas, and they wind up influencing John the Evangelist. And so if you read the first chapter of John, which is one of the greatest passages in all of the Christian canon, you're looking at somebody who has incorporated philosophy, Greek philosophy. So, and it helped us enrich our theology. So, we can be better from this stuff rather than just, ignoring it or whatever. So the angels, the angelic element is a thing that we get really strongly out of Daniel. But we also get this other concept that I like the Common English Bible calls the human one. And I really like that phrase. It's what we would traditionally call in English the Son of Man. It's a concept that's not unique to Daniel. Ezekiel uses it. I believe both Isaiah and Jeremiah use it. It's a title that's often used to refer to the prophet themselves. An angelic being says, "Son of Man," blah 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 blah. But there's this element to it that reflects sort of a choosing, and so the Common English Bible likes to use "human one" as the phrase, and I think it's kind of great, right? You're one, right? You're unique. You're a one. You've been specially chosen, but you're human. So the human one, and it's this phrase that's used that's early on used for prophets to refer to themselves in their prophetic works, but in Daniel it starts to take on this other dimension where it's more than just a prophetic figure. We see in Daniel 7 verse 13 where, let me turn the page here, where it says, "As I continued to watch this night vision of mine, I suddenly saw one like a human being coming with the heavenly clouds. He came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. Rule, glory, and kingship were given to him. All peoples, nations, and languages will serve him. His rule is an everlasting one. It will never pass away. His kingship is indestructible." So Daniel conceives of this human one, this Son of Man, this figure, not just as a special prophet, but as a ruler, as a king, as somebody who, has a close relation, who comes in the clouds of heaven. So this divine element to it. And this captures the Jewish imagination because they start thinking about this figure, particularly throughout the Roman period. We start to see it, given that this is referring to the Greek, the Greek history, or the time of the Greeks in Judaism and Antiochus and all of that. You can see how this idea applies to, say, Judas Maccabee, who is seen as someone who's chosen by God to liberate God's people. And he winds up becoming a figure that shows up repeatedly throughout Jewish history, particularly during Passover, where there's always somebody who wants to become the next Judas Maccabee who tries to rebel against the Romans, and it doesn't work out well for them, which is part of the reason why the Pharisees are so quick to sell Jesus, out to the Roman government, because every time somebody does this, a bunch of people die, and so they're worried that Jesus is trying to, he's going to do it too. They don't anticipate that he's doing it differently. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. But this human one is this, what we call Messiah, the chosen one, anointed one, this one who is being used by God to establish some future reign, some future realm. Now, there was some debate about this and still within scholarship, and particularly Jewish scholarship, a bunch of debate over what this means. This idea of a Messiah is sometimes interpreted as sort of being a personification of Israel as a whole, not just as an individual. But Daniel seems to defy that understanding. So within Judaism, there's of course the idea that there is one day going to be a Messiah, and that Messiah will show up. Christianity, in fact, holds on to that idea, where our beliefs about all of this and the eschaton are identical to what Judaism largely believes. The difference for us is that we were sort of given a peek behind the curtain at who the Messiah was ahead of time. So, we know who that Messiah will be. We will recognize that final Messiah as Jesus. just sort of how it is for us. But like I said, this idea is further developed during the Greek and Roman period, particularly in reflection of Judah Maccabee, the one who defeats Antiochus IV and oversees the restoration of the temple. However, the idea arises that all these figures are rough drafts of the real thing, and a final human one that will end the cycles of violence and oppression will come. This development we see with a very obscure book. So get ready to have some fun. I know I've gone over time, and I hope you'll forgive me for it. You can, of course, always pause and view later. So that's the cool thing about doing this online. But if you have a Bible with the Apocrypha, particularly a Bible with the Apocrypha that the Episcopal Church uses, you will find the book of 2nd Esdras. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time with this. I'm going to give you, it's a super weird book, and it's got a very profoundly complicated pedigree, because 2nd Esdras is actually known by a whole bunch of other names, particularly 5th Ezra and 4th Ezra. And then there's another Ezra book that's actually 3 different books kind of Voltroned together in a book. The issue is that the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox Church holds this book as canonical. It's part of their Christian canon. They are the only church, well, I guess the Eritrean Tewahedo Orthodox Church, which is an offshoot of the Ethiopians, would also hold it. So those are the only churches that actually hold it as canonical. The Greeks don't even include it in their Apocrypha. My Greek study Bible doesn't even have it. But it does exist in the Apocrypha that is used in the Roman Catholic Church, as well as by us in the Episcopal Church and Lutherans and Methodists and whoever who used the Apocrypha. What's interesting about it is that so 5th Esdras, which is like the first couple chapters of 2nd Esdras, is without a doubt a Christian book that was sort of, late vintage book. But 4th Esdras scholars see as a Jewish apocalypse. And what's interesting about that is, well, there's some debate. So the Ethiopian church believes fully that this thing was written during the Babylonian captivity, and that it is prophetic utterances looking for the future. More conventional scholarship argues that it is dated to around the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed by the Romans. And again, hearkening back to the Babylonian era for its purposes, which is a common theme in apocalyptic literature, because we'll see that Revelation does the same thing. But I wanted to bring this up because, keep in mind, scholars say it's a Jewish apocalypse, not a Christian apocalypse. Okay, so I want to keep that in mind, because it offers a very key development in the understanding of this human one messianic figure. All right, so if you again, 2nd Esdras 13, starting at verse 2. I looked and saw a wind rising from the sea and stirring up all its waves. As I watched, this wind made something like the figure of a man come up out of the heart of the sea. That man was flying among the clouds of heaven. Wherever he turned his face to look, everything that fell under his gaze trembled. Wherever an utterance came from his mouth, all who heard his voice melted as wax melts when it feels the fire. And then it goes on and on about some other things. Then it says, after these things, I saw the same man coming down from the mountain and calling to himself another crowd, a peaceful one. Many people came to him. Some were rejoicing and some were sad. Some were even tied up, while some were bringing other people as an offering. And then later, the Ezra of this book talks to an angel, and the angel tells him, that you saw a man coming up from the heart of the sea, that is the one whom the Most High has been keeping for many ages. He will liberate God's creation all by himself, and he will put in order those who are left. When all the nations hear his voice, then each one will leave its own region and will leave off the wars that they were waging against each other. So I said, Supreme Lord, show me why I saw a man rising up from the heart of the sea. He said to me, just as no one can seek out or know what is in the depth of the sea, so no one on earth can see my son or those who are with him, except in that time when his day has come. So here's the thing. Okay. Again, it's a Jewish apocalyptic writing. Scholars think it comes from AD 70. The Ethiopian church holds that it comes from the Babylonian exile. What's interesting about this is that the image is very rich, right? And I actually just came across this, really paid attention to this stuff for preparing for tonight. So I was really blown away by this. The image of this human one coming out of the sea, to me, immediately, I think of Jesus coming up out of the water at baptism, right? On top of that, the idea of the wind and all this kind of stuff adds credence to the image of Jesus walking on the sea when during that storm of the sea when Jesus walks on the water, which is an image that has never made sense to me and really why I didn't include it. But if it's drawing on this prophecy, then it makes sense why Jesus would do this. So this is why it's important to know the Apocrypha. This idea of, wherever an utterance came out of, people, tremble and they melt like wax, right? They respond to his words. And then this idea of him, as it says right here, he came down from the mountain and calling to himself another crowd where the Sermon on the Mount and his crowd's following him after that. So, there's this stuff that's very you see it right with Jesus just explicitly. So that means that either the gospel writers, some of whom were writing after the fall of the temple, the gospels that we have are compiled after the fall of the temple, that they were aware of this and that they are sort of drawing on this prophetic book that or some common idea that Jews were all drawing from, and they're using it to show that Jesus embodies this idea. Or the Ethiopian church is right, and this was a prophecy that Jesus fulfills. Either way, Jesus is embodying something that is being held within Jewish imagination. And so I find this extremely fascinating and adds more depth to the idea that Jesus is more than just sort of an arbitrary figure that we sort of try, people tried to paint the bullseye around or whatever. It's near impossible for him to fulfill all of this stuff, right? So anyway, so that we see this development of this human one idea being a particular figure described as being God's son, coming up out of the sea, which is interesting because that's in contradistinction to how Daniel depicted the beasts of the evil kingdoms coming out of the sea. So we have another thing emerging from the sea, but it's bringing in an era of peace and the end of war. And so again, there's just a lot to chew on, I think. And it opens up this idea of this vision of a future where Jesus is this messianic figure. And not only does he come within known history, but we look for his second coming. And so we can see the broad strokes of what's being brought to us in this apocalyptic work, in this apocalyptic literature. So again, there's a lot of information that I threw at you guys tonight. But what I hope that you come away with is this idea of seeing how apocalyptic writing, particularly of the Jewish era, is using various eras in histories to sort of interpret one another. It's layers upon layers. It's folding in on itself, right? But it's all ultimately drawing from this moment in Babylon. That's really that's where we realize that Babylon and the Babylonian exile is so definitive for the Jewish imagination and has impacted our religion in pretty immense ways, because it showed that's the moment where it all came to a head, where sins and failures and all of that came, there was a comeuppance, and so we're reminded that it can always happen again, and that in the end God is going to undo that, and he's going to rescue us from that cycle. And as Christians, we believe that Jesus has rescued us from that cycle, and that we are saved, and that we look forward for the day when he comes in his fullness and his glory to show, hey, it's done, and I'm satisfying all of this religious longing of the human heart and the human imagination. Everything you've been looking for is satisfied in me, because I am God's anointed, I am God's chosen, I am the human one. So there we go. I'm going to give you guys a moment to put, I know, again, we're late, so I appreciate it. 7 of you are still here. If you have any questions or comments or anything that you want to bring up in the sidebar, I welcome them. So I'm going to sip my tea and give you that opportunity. If you're typing, and while you're typing, I'll let you know, I just cooked through 10 pages of notes. it's hardly exhaustive. I mean, I was daunted just looking at the book of Ezekiel, which is, like 42 chapters. And I was like, there's no way I'm going to go through a whole book in this amount of time. All right. So, provided nothing pops up while I'm giving these final conclusions, I just want to remind everyone next week. Here we go. What were some of the sources used for research? We want to look more into this ourselves. Good. So I spent a lot of time with Robert Alter's The Hebrew Bible. This is Robert Alter is a linguist and poet, and he produced this really fantastic English translation of the Hebrew Bible that the translation itself is really good, but all of his essays relating to it is just really fantastic. He gives a lot of history. He distills a lot of the scholarship into pretty easily readable ways, and so he offers introductions to a lot of the books. So I thought this was this is if you're interested, I mean, this is almost a must purchase. I think there's 3 volumes. It's sold in 1 volume, but it's 3 books, and they're heavy and huge. I will say I'll talk about his opening essay to it is called On Translation and the Heresy of Explanation. And he talks about why a lot of English translations of the Bible are lacking because of our attempt at trying to explain everything rather than letting the language be vague and poetic. And he actually says that in a lot of cases, the King James Bible is better in translating Hebrew text into English because it allows for that poetic stuff to come through rather than being bogged down and trying to make literal word for word translations. So it's kind of an interesting thing, but that essay is excellent. And it's in the front of all 3 volumes. So you get your fill of it. So I read that. I of course looked at stuff within the Orthodox Study Bible. This is also another great resource. I love it. I was sad though that Second Esdras was not in here, so I couldn't get their take on it. But this includes a lot of great footnotes from the Church Fathers, and kind of explains how the Orthodox tradition interprets various passages. They're very unapologetic in incorporating and infusing Christology in their notes about the Old Testament, which I think is really great because as much as I love a lot of the newer English translations of the Bible, they're of course being much more strict scholars, and so they're wanting to approach their study notes on the Old Testament from a strictly Jewish and Hebrew standpoint rather than from the way that Christians might read it. And so the Orthodox Study Bible does not do that. It's an interesting translation because it's not, it's 2 translations combined. It is a New English translation of the Septuagint for the Old Testament. And then it uses, I believe it's the New King James. Is it the New King James for the New Testament? And so, New King James version of the Bible is the New Testament in it. But it's it's a very it's a new version of the Septuagint in English in here, as well as that. The Jewish Study Bible is an English Bible, but it's just the Old Testament, and it's treated like your contemporary Christian study Bibles. It's a really cool little resource. I didn't use it that much. I've used it a lot in the past, so I do have some residual memory of that. But then the big thing, of course, I like is this is the Common English Study Bible. I like the translation a lot. I like the study notes in it as well. It's got some great sidebar information on different things. And again, the translation is very fascinating. I will just note, in case you weren't there before when I talked about this Bible, this is my own custom-made cover. The version of the Apocrypha, as far as I know, is still only available in hardbound. I don't like hardbound Bibles. There's just something to me. It's the residual Baptist to me. The Bible needs to be floppy. I need to be able to flip and roll the pages and stuff. So I bought the hardbound one and I cut the cover off and made my own duct tape cover to make it floppy. And then I also read, I shared this last week. But another great book in my preparations for this, and just it's fun. It's just a fun book. Is the Pocket Guide to the Apocalypse, which may very well be out of print now. This is the version that was published back when Relevant magazine was, which is an evangelical Christian magazine, was still publishing books. But it's just a fun little concise, very humorous and slightly irreverent book on apocalyptic stuff. Mostly addressing the evangelical premillennial dispensationalist approach to eschatology, but very insightful and fun. So that's one. And then on top of that, I've just got a bunch of residual stuff from throughout my seminary years, just sort of floating around in my brain. Unfortunately, I'm not. Both Kathy Grebe and Kate Sondreger were professors at Virginia Seminary when I was there. And both of them possess this amazing photographic memory where they can quote back to you like page reference and number and everything for anything you want to know. Like I had a friend who in seminary was having trouble with their thesis, and they approached Kate Sondreger and asked her about a resource. And her answer was something like, well, if you go to Karl Barth's Dogmatics 4.1 on page 286 at footnote 182, you'll find the source. I believe you'll find the source you need. And she was right. I'm just got the book reference wrong. Like that was not inflated at all. Like that's exactly like how it went down. I wish I had that kind of memory, because I wish I could tell you that, all of that. I will say that a couple of good resources that I do have. I have the Cambridge Companion to Orthodox Theology, which I've read, and it's got an entry on eschatology. The Cambridge Companion to Postmodern Theology is another thing I've read over the years that I've got a bunch of stuff in my head from. And then as well as a smattering of things from the Desert Fathers that unfortunately I shouldn't say unfortunately. I opted to, I still need to subscribe to it, which is the Logos Bible software. But because the Logos Bible software offered a bunch of stuff that I already had sitting in my office back in Florida, I decided to subscribe to that. So I left a bunch of my stuff in Florida, which I kind of regret. I kind of regret that I didn't bring more. But, moving across the continent and the ocean, you have to make sacrifices, and books are very heavy and they charge by the pound. So yeah, but those just for this class right now, those are the main resources that I used and in my preparation for that. Yeah. So, all right. Well, next week is going to be a pre-recorded class. I will try to have it up in time for 6 o'clock. It'll probably be up earlier. So if you want to, watch it, anytime during the day, you can. It's a reminder, I'm doing that because I have my mother arriving. Oh, you're welcome. I have my mother arriving in the late afternoon, so I want to, obviously spend time with her. So I'll be pre-recording that, but we'll be talking mostly about the Book of Revelation and the way Christians have incorporated this apocalyptic stuff. Not only will we talk about the Book of Revelation, we'll also look at the apocalypses of Jesus within the Gospels, because Jesus offers a couple of apocalyptic things. Because lest we forget, in addition to being our Messiah and our Savior and the lover of our souls, he's also a prophet, and he had some pretty pointed things to say about society at its time. So we'll look at that as well. And so I look forward to it, and I hope you look forward to it also. And I will I won't see you next week. My digital avatar, the digital approximation of myself that is recorded in a series of algorithms and stored on a server, will see you next week. But I hope to see you Sunday. So I hope you all have a good weekend. Stay safe out there. And God bless you all, and take care and have a good night. And mahalo and aloha. Oh, actually, you know what? I shouldn't turn off just yet. Prayers. Let's say our prayers. So the Lord be with you. Gracious God, we thank you for this night and for this blessed opportunity to be gathered together. And we thank you for revealing your truth to us through prophets and sages and apostles. Help us to have our eyes open always to see you at work in creation, O Lord, and to be aware of all that you're doing. And that even when times are dark and when times seem uncertain, you are there, and that you are behind the scenes, that in the end you are victorious. And because you are victorious, we are victorious. Thank you, Lord, for this night. In your name we pray. Amen. All right. God bless you all. Have a good rest of the week. And I'll see you later.